Each year, Microsoft Research hosts hundreds of influential speakers from around the world, including leading scientists, renowned experts in technology, book authors, and leading academics, and makes videos of these lectures freely available.
It's my extreme pleasure to welcome Sherry Turkle back to the Microsoft Research Visiting Speakers Series. She's here to discuss her latest book, Reclaiming Conversation, in which she investigates how a flight from conversation undermines our relationships, creativity, and productivity, and why reclaiming face-to-face conversation can help us regain ground. She's a professor at MIT, the founder and director of the MIT Initiative on Technology and Self. She has over 5 books. The book that I think recently that's set her on fire is Alone Together from 2011. An amazing book that I think brought the conversation forward. Over 30 years of perspective on talking on this subject. I wanted to paraphrase Jonathan Franzen's review of her book in the New York Times that says, Sherry Turkle is a powerful voice in the discourse about technology. She's a skeptic who was once a believer, a clinical psychologist among the industry shills, a humanist, but not a Luddite, a grown-up. And then particularly close to our heart, unlike Jaron Lanier, who bears the stodgy weight of being a Microsoft guy, Turkle is a respected insider. As such, she serves as kind of the conscience for the real tech world. So it's my true honor. Please join me in giving Sherry Turkle a warm welcome. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, you know, it's pretty fantastic to be reviewed by Jonathan Franzen in the New York Times. There's nothing to be complaining about that, but it was very awkward to be compared to my best friends with Jonathan Franzen, a shill for Microsoft. And then worse than that, if it can get worse than that, Evgeny Morozov, a very distinguished critic of technology. He was dismissed as Belarusian, a kind of sad Belarusian. And I, on the other hand, am a perky Brooklynite. So we'll see how that goes. Well, let me say thank you for that introduction. I'm glad you mentioned Alone Together because I was here. I mean, I remember the room talking about Alone Together, and the work that I'm doing now follows really directly from a question that bothered me at the end of Alone Together, and that I just committed myself to answering. And so this book is a little bit different. The voice is different. My attitude is different than others of my work. Because in others of my work, I sort of had, 10 years, 8 years, 9 years of NSF grants. I kind of reported out on the questions I had set myself. And then that was the book. Here, I had a question at the end of Alone Together. And I set myself, 5, 6 years to be like an Energizer bunny of research and to try to find some answers. And here was the question. At the end of Alone Together, when I went through all the transcripts, people kept saying, I'd rather text than talk. I'd rather text than talk. And then they started giving me reasons why they'd rather text than talk. And by text, I don't just mean text, I mean every kind of online communication, whether it's messaging or email or texting, whatever, chat. And I'd say, why don't you want to have a conversation? And they'd say, conversation. I'll tell you what's wrong with conversation. It takes place in real time, and you can't control what you're going to say. In other words, it's spontaneous, it's open-ended, you have to do it when you're there. You don't know how long it's going to last. You can't multitask. I mean, they were right. All of that is wrong with conversation, but I'm a psychologist, and I know about the work that conversation can do, that it does do developmentally and in terms of and relationally. It's the birth of, it's the most human and humanizing thing we do. It's where empathy and intimacy are born. It's where we show our vulnerability to each other. I mean, it does a lot of work. It doesn't mean that, you know, my book is not anti-technology at all. It's just very pro-conversation. It just tries to force us to remember the work that conversation does. So I just thought, okay, what about if they mean it? What is the state of conversation today? And what about if these people mean? And they weren't just people like young people. It wasn't just like 15 to 25-year-olds, you know, who had grown up with smartphones who were telling me this. It was lawyers and doctors and management consultants and every kind of 60-year-old who was basically saying, I like the control that I have when I don't have to face somebody face to face, including my children. People who were telling me they'd rather fight by text, they'd rather have their family fights by text. People who were telling me they'd rather communicate with their kids by text so that they can get exactly what they want to say down and not have to worry about being misunderstood. Anyway, long story short, I decided to go on this odyssey and figure out the state of conversation in American culture today. It's only an American book. There are incredible things happening internationally. I'm just hoping this begins a conversation about conversation and people take up this story internationally. So it's a kind of story about where conversation is today. And you know, the top level answer to my question of did they mean it was they meant it. They meant it. They would rather text than talk. There is a crisis, I call it a flight from conversation of a particular kind. It's not that we're not talking, but the kind of conversation where people show vulnerability, where the spontaneity, where things are allowed to go off on a tangent and can come back, where people give themselves a lot of time. That kind of conversation is stuff that people want to do less. And then the second big finding is that people are in terrible conflict about this. This is a book of truly unhappy campers. In other words, it isn't a book about two generations in conflict, and it isn't a book about things going to hell because people are, you know, dead set on changing the world and not talking to each other anymore. It's a book truly about people in conflict. And to me, the conflict is exemplified by a Pew study that came out after the book was written, so I couldn't even use it, which basically was a very, which is a Pew study that many people have cited as though it contradicts my book, my work. But I read it very differently because it shows how integrated cell phones are into everyday life, which I think doesn't contradict what I'm saying at all. Anyway, the statistic I like in that study is that 89% of adult Americans say that in their last social interaction, they took out a phone. And 82% of them say that they thought it deteriorated the conversation they were in. And that's basically what I found, that people have integrated into their social norms a gesture something like this, just give me a sec to do something on my phone, be back with you. I'm going to put you on pause just for a sec, do something on my phone. And that in the course of doing that, they've come to realize, and they have come to realize, that something is being lost. And that essentially, that something being lost, something is gained, and then something is being lost. So there's always, and then also, what I've also come to realize is that I did a lot of work on studying, well, what about other technical innovations? People say, well, the book was like that, it interrupted conversation. What about the book? And I want to just, begin by stressing the specificity. I think it's very important to look at the history of technology and, to understand that this isn't the first time that technology has disrupted how we talk to each other. But also to respect and kind of honor the moment we're at now and the particular vulnerabilities in us that it touches. Because with a book, the social mores that we allowed to grow up around the book. And I feel very strongly that the issue here is not the phone. The issue here is the social mores that we have constructed around the phone. With the book, it just never happened that I would be in a conversation with you and say, really interested in that story about you and your dad, but just, could I just have, time for 2 paragraphs of Madame Bovary and get back to you? It doesn't happen. We don't do it. So the question is why this device, in such a short time, we literally do that. I can be in a discussion with my daughter, she's, and she will literally, do that on any, just time enough to go to the people in the phone. And then after I'm off pause, she will come back to me. And this happens to most of us 10, 20, 30 times a day. And then the question is, what does that do to us? And I'll be talking for about 35, 40 minutes, and I'll be citing some experiments. I'm not an experimentalist, so these are experiments that I didn't do, but that I bring together in this book that really make the case that what that does is really give empathy a hit. One of the most interesting experiments is that if you put a phone, just do the experiment of putting a phone in between 2 people at lunch, 2 things happen. The subjects that they will discuss in that conversation change dramatically. They become, and it's not really surprising, you start to talk about things where you wouldn't mind being interrupted. That is to say, you start to talk about more trivial things. And second, and much more interesting for me, or even more interesting for me, is that the 2 people feel less empathic connection towards each other. They feel less of a stake in the conversation. Also, not surprising, people are putting each other on hold. You're sort of saying, well, you're somebody who I can leave in order to go to all the other people in my life. So let me begin. I thought what I would do to begin is I would give some vignettes that capture the range of this kind of flight from conversation or crisis in conversation in relation to empathy from different parts of the book, because the book does arc from the conversations we have with ourselves in solitude and in self-reflection, all the way to politics and romance and love and families and friendship. I mean, it takes the arc of the human, life cycle basically, and takes the story of conversation through all those times, and then it ends actually, and I don't think I'm going to talk about it here. But it ends on conversations with artificial intelligence, because one of the things that I'm very interested in is conversations with the kind of artificial intelligence that tries to convince you that it cares about you and is competent to form an empathic relationship with you. So whether it's Hello Barbie, I haven't seen this doll, I've only read about it in the New York Times, was interviewed about it, it was described to me, but I haven't held this doll in my hands, so I don't know. But from what I read, it kind of comes out of the box. Hello, I have a sister, I don't like her, I hear that you have a sister, do you like your sister, let's chat. Comes out with apparently a human life ready to dish and ask you about your feelings about your human life. And from years of studying sociable robotics at MIT, with Kismet and Cog, and particularly with Kismet, a doll that was developed by Cynthia Brazil, that had enough of the cadence of human speech, although not really the meaning of human speech, and enough facial expression in the responses to kids, and Paro, which was designed for the elderly. I have very strong feelings that pretend empathy, that we have to ask ourselves have to ask ourselves hard questions about whether offering pretend empathy to kids and the elderly, which are the two target populations, the first two target populations for this kind of robotic object, whether pretend empathy teaches empathy, and whether at this juncture where we're seemingly deciding not to talk to each other as much, why are we so hot to give objects that don't understand at all to our children and to our elderly? And I raise that question, and I really want to start that conversation, because I really don't think there's a lot of, you have parents who are buying baby bouncers with a slot for the iPad, just putting their kid, not talking to the kid. They're buying potty trainers with a slot for the iPad, and the kid is alone looking at a screen and not talking to the kid. And then now they're going to give them a Hello Barbie to talk to. I'm a worried person. So I want to talk about all that. I want this conversation about conversation, because conversation does a tremendous amount of work developmentally, and I think that we need to be talking about it soon. We need to be talking about it soon. So here are my vignettes. Let me start with the child vignette, since I was talking about children and my concerns about their robot friends. I interview a man in his 40s, and just turning 40, who has an 11-year-old daughter, and he talks about his fondest memories are of giving this daughter a bath when she was younger, as a toddler, as a baby, and chatting with her at that time. Playing with her little guys in the bathtub, the reveries and the singing and the chat. Now he has a 2-year-old, and he doesn't do that at all. When he gives her a bath, he puts down the seat on the toilet bowl, and he does his email on his iPhone. And he tells me this story, and he says, I feel so bad about this. I feel so bad about this. And the phrase that came to my mind, kind of author's choice, is my favorite line in this book, is technology makes us forget what we know about life. Because he knows something about life. He knows about the importance of conversation with his toddler. And he knows that this isn't right. And yet every night he sits in the bathroom. That's his job. He does the bath. And he does his mail. And to me, this is a story, this is the kind of story, when I talked about unhappy campers and conversation, this is a very typical story from parents who are sort of behaving as though on a kind of automatic pilot that makes them, and actually makes their kids unhappy, because I also am going to report on a lot of pushback from kids. Another story. Let me take a story from my own world. I live in a world where a standard faculty meeting is, you come into the faculty meeting, I don't know if it's being taped, so but you come into the faculty meeting, you sit down, you take out your laptop, and you start to do your email. I mean, this is sort of and that is how a faculty meeting goes. And going around the country and looking at different companies, I've learned that the really good meeting leaders are the ones who 5 minutes before it's your turn to speak give you a signal that it's your turn to speak, so you can close out your email and be ready to speak. I'm seeing people nod yes, so I guess it's not that different at MIT than at Microsoft. But anyway, that's my environment. So I'm not, a snob about, oh, I live in a world of, I live in a different world than everybody else. I would live in everybody else's world. But when it comes to my students, I'm extremely old school. I want to see them in my office. I want office hours. I have a lot of office hours. They have to come to see me. They have to go do their papers with me. I was inspired by my teachers. I want to see my students. They're paying a ton of money. I want to see my students. My students don't want to see me. My students don't want to see me. And I'm famouser than I used to be. And I ask them, why don't you want to see me? Why don't you want to come to office hours? And I don't get back, you're intimidating, you're famous, you're, you're inaccessible, you're on the road. I don't get that back. I get back this, that they want to send me an email. They want to send me a perfect email that perfectly describes their problem. And then they want me to send them a perfect email. I mean, first of all, the idea, let's give them that they could send me a perfect email. But the idea that at 2 o'clock in the morning when I do my email, in my bunny slippers, I'm going to be sending them a perfect email. This is sort of, I always don't want to even tell them how this defies logic. But I'm going to send them back a perfect email that will give them the most value because I will be able to see their problem and respond to their exact problem. Now, all of us here love learning. We're here because we studied, we were inspired, we're lit up by ideas. And everyone who is lit up by ideas and loves learning got there. But let me put it the other way. No one who is lit up by ideas and loves learning, or later you can talk to me if you're in this set, got there because they sent a perfect email and got a perfect email back. Or they sent a perfect letter and somebody typed a perfect letter back. It's because, I mean, speaking for myself, I went in to see somebody and with no idea, and somebody said, not too much of an idea, but come back again. I'm listening to you. Or I went in with a bad idea, and somebody said, not a great idea, but I can help you make it better. I'm interested in you. And this notion, this transactional instead of relational notion of what a conversation is, and the notion of perfection that we're teaching our kids, that is feeding in to this flight from conversation, because in conversation face-to-face, we can't be perfect. I'm not being perfect now. But if I was reading from a script, I could be perfect. And it's taken me a long time to not just read from a script, because I wanted to give a perfect lecture. And finally I realized, well then, if they wanted to hear a perfect thing, they would read me. And really, people come to see people in person because they want to see when I pause and when I hesitate, and they want to watch me thinking. And it's more scary, as anyone who's ever stood in front of a room knows. But it's really why we come together, which I finally figured out very late. And this is what my students haven't figured out. They're into this transactional notion of what's going to happen. I mean, it's one thing to do it in a presentation, but it's another thing to do it in an office hour. And they are afraid of not performing. They are afraid of spontaneous conversation. Let me now talk about something political, because the book turns to politics. And I'm a child of the 60s, and I was very interested to write about the kinds of conversations that are happening in digital culture and the kinds of conversations that are not happening in digital culture. I feel very strongly about this because I really feel that conversations about privacy, for example, in digital culture are conversations that we have. It's like every year, it's a little bit like climate change. We need to have this conversation, and then you wake up and it's an unbelievably beautiful sunny day. And you say, it's like collectively, we say to ourselves, maybe we can have this conversation tomorrow. It's kind of like, as a society, it's like, oh, maybe I don't need to think about this today. And I think it's a little bit like that with digital privacy. We absolutely need to think about this, and then maybe I can just have another week when I don't have to think about this. Because all of the parts that need to be thought of to actually make a dent in this problem and address it are so huge and important. But I got a lot of, but what I don't like are people who dismiss it and say, you know, with, oh, well, we're just moving into a different era, people have different attitudes about privacy now, and these attitudes have put us into a different way of thinking, because privacy and democracy are really not about your attitudes towards privacy and democracy. This isn't really a question of your attitude about privacy and democracy. It's like, the question is, can you have democracy without privacy? It's not really, can you feel good about not having privacy? Which is somehow the way a lot of the conversation has gone. You know, do kids feel okay about not having privacy? It's really more, can you have a working democracy without privacy, which is a very different question. Anyway, let me tell you about this one girl. I interviewed her at a time, I don't want to get into exactly the time, but it was a time when, let's just say, you know, people of color were being shot for like having the wrong turn signal on or not, you know, or just it was a very bad time racially, and a lot of street violence, and a time when American society was really not at its best, showing itself to be divided and divisive, and without a place for a civil conversation. And I interview her about politics and about her opinions. She had just graduated from Ivy League school. She was an economist. She was going to take a job in, going to take her first job in the financial industry. And she says to me, I'm so glad I don't have any controversial opinions. Because if I had any controversial opinions, I would have to express them on the web. And it's not private there, and Google keeps all my searches, and all my opinions would be there forever, and that would be a bad thing. So I'm so glad I don't have any controversial opinions. She didn't say, I'm so nervous about my opinions because the only place to put them is on the web, and I'm really concerned about privacy there and the whole regime there, which is a different thing to say. She said, I'm so glad I don't have any controversial opinions. And I think that, you know, one of the rules in qualitative methods that I teach my students is that you never report on a story, on a finding, on a quote, unless you have a very deep bench, or else it's not interesting if one person says something interesting, because it doesn't ring true. It's like a one-off thing. So I heard this kind of thing a lot. The feeling that there is a chilling in actually what we allow ourselves to think, the mind space we have, because we live in an environment where we feel that we have no privacy, and we feel that, you know, there's no mind space for thinking. And in Reclaiming Conversation, I contrast that with my growing up in Brooklyn in the 50s, early 60s, as a little girl, and with a grandmother who had known a totalitarian regime, who was very marked by what had happened in Germany during the war. And she'd always taken me to the kind of local library about twice a week as I grew up. And then when I was about 10, anybody here from Brooklyn who knows what I'm talking about? No, one. When I was about 2. When I was about 10, she says, now we're going to the real library. That was at Grand Army Plaza. It was like a giant library. And here's what you need to know. Every book, and this is in the shadow of the McCarthy hearings, so people were scared. She said, every book you take out from the library is a secret between you and the library. No one can ever know the books that you take out from the library. You could read the Communist Manifesto and no one would ever, ever legally have the right to know. So it was a sense from my youngest age, she didn't really know about J. Edgar Hoover. I mean, there were things that were missing from her picture of America. But, I'm an anthropologist. I read Mary Douglas. I read, I know that what's transgressive counts because what's transgressive isn't part of the system. So it matters that my grandmother knew what the rules were. And the rules were that I had mind space. I had mind space. And when the Clarence Thomas, Anita Hill hearings were happening, Anita Hill's lawyers wanted to subpoena Clarence Thomas's video store rental records to see if he rented pornography. And his lawyers argued that his video store rental records were protected in the same way that books from the public library were protected. And they won. And I really wanted to see his video store rental records. I really did. But I knew that I shouldn't, that he deserved his mind space and that my grandmother would have wanted him to have that. So again, what is intimacy without privacy? What is democracy without privacy? These are questions for conversation today. And then another story, which will lead me to talking directly about empathy, is a young woman who talked to me about what she called the rule of three. The rule of seven. In my book, there's the rule of three and there's the rule of seven. I mean, people gave funny names to all their new etiquettes around conversation. So the rule of seven is that it takes 7 minutes. It takes 7 minutes for you to figure out in a conversation whether or not it's going to be interesting. You have to get used to each other's sort of bodies in space, each other's voices, the way you hesitate, the way you this. There are lulls, it gets quiet, it picks up again, where are you from, yada, 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 getting used to it, and maybe people in a good mood, maybe somebody's hungry, Anyway, it takes 7 minutes, is the right time. She said 7 minutes, and then she said, I'm not willing to put in my 7 minutes. When there's a lull, I go to my phone. And that was very interesting because that theme of when there's a lull, I go to my phone. When there's a boring bit, I just pick up my phone and go to my phone, was really the reason that I found people texting in funerals. When I interviewed them, why are you texting in a funeral? They said it was boring. They didn't give me like a big explanation about, bowling alone, or about loss of community. They just said, I couldn't tolerate the boring bits. So it actually reminds me of a study, another very classic study that was done, where college students were asked to sit alone in a chair, no book, no phone, and they were asked in that situation, do you think you would want to give yourself an electroshock? And they said, are you effing kidding me? No, what is this, the Milgram experiment? No, this is absolutely not. And after 6 minutes, they self-administered electroshocks rather than sit quietly with their own thoughts. There is an intolerance for just being alone with our own thoughts. A crisis in solitude, a crisis in a capacity for solitude that goes along with a crisis in a capacity for conversation, and I'll be ending on that in a little while. So what about this crisis with empathy? Because of course, if you can't tolerate being in a conversation that might have boring bits, because again, this is you can take the girl out of psychoanalysis, but you can't take the psychoanalysis out of the girl. I mean, it's in the moments when we are quiet and stumble and hesitate and and look for our words that we reveal ourselves to each other, truly. You know, it's when I kind of look up or I'm trying to find something, you say, well, she's thinking. That's when she's thinking. Okay, 5 minutes, okay. I had my thought on something. Where was I? Anyway, I was making the empathy connection, and I was brought to this empathy connection at first when I was contacted by the dean of the school I call the Holbrook School. Everything is disguised in my book, who were saying that their students had less empathic connection with each other, that the 8-year-olds were playing on the school grounds like the 12-year-olds were behaving like 8-year-olds. They didn't seem able to put each other in each other's place. The students would rather text than talk. Essentially, the teachers were saying that there was this crisis in empathy. And I guess in closing, what the teachers were finally pointed to was that what the children did in the lunchroom was not talk to each other. They looked at their phones and talked about the stuff on their phones. And they asked the question, is this the new conversation? Because if so, it wasn't doing the work of the old conversation. These children seemed to understand each other less, seemed less able to put each other in each other's place less. And I found this, this preoccupation with empathy, you know, so widespread in the culture. And I think did I mention the college age students where in the past 20 years, there's been a 40% decline in all the ways we know how to mark empathy among college students. What I think I didn't say is that the researcher who did that study has turned, in her depression about her finding, to writing empathy apps. And that's a very big question for everyone sitting in this room about whether or not, if we acknowledge that technology has gotten us into this trouble, what is the role of technology in getting us out of this trouble? To what degree are we the empathy app? To what degree, you know, is it we who need to step up and be the empathy app? And I like to say that conversation is the talking cure, because we're quite resilient, and studies show that in only 5 days without their phones, adolescents begin to get back all of those markers for empathy, for example, in a summer camp without devices. So that, you know, I feel that we're at a moment when, and the question is, how do they do it? They do it because they talk to each other. They do it because they talk to each other. So just in conclusion, reclaiming conversation is not about how we should give up our phones. It's about using them mindfully. It's about putting them in their place. Because when we do, conversation is there to reclaim. And I think that for the failing connections of our digital world, for these people who are doing one thing and unhappy and feeling that they're missing their children even as they're ignoring their children, it's the talking cure, as I said. And I just want to end by saying that there's a paradox in my argument, or a seeming paradox that I just want to end on, that my narrative about conversation in the book is riddled through with a conversation about solitude. It begins with solitude and it ends with solitude. And many people in writing about my work, basically say, hey, Turco wants us to put away our phones when we're together. I get it, I get it, I get it. Give her that. But why does she care if when I'm alone, and they cite the work of Keith Hampton on this, why does she care if when I'm alone, I take out my phone? I mean, who am I hurt? What's that hurt? And my argument is that you need to be able to have a contentment in your solitude, to be able to feel good within yourself, not like one of these kids who's going to electroshock yourself after 6 minutes without a steady feed, in order to then come to another person and really listen to what they have to say and not feel you need to project onto them what you need to hear. So solitude, the capacity to gather yourself, and that's what I mean by solitude. I don't mean like being alone or taking a walk. I mean the capacity for solitude, which is considered the developmental achievement, the signal developmental achievement of childhood. The capacity to, you don't have to be alone to have it. I mean, it's the capacity to gather yourself and be content with who you are, allows you to listen to someone else and hear who they are, rather than sort of make them be who you need them to be to support your fragile self. And if you are turning to your phone every time there's a lull, I think you're going to have a harder time getting there. And I think all this mindfulness stuff, which I have such respect for, is sort of the tip of the iceberg of people trying to say something like that and articulate that. And so, just in conclusion, I think we're the empathy app. I think we're the empathy app. I think we don't have to give up our phones. I'm not giving up mine in case there's any, despite what you read in the press. I think it's not about anything wrong with the technology. The technology can be designed for our vulnerabilities, to the ways in which we use it not mindfully. I think industry has a tremendous role to play in making it easier for us to use it mindfully. I want to be part of that conversation. But it's on us to, look up and look at each other and start the conversation. Thank you. And I'd love your questions. Yes.
So shortly after you visited a few years ago to speak on Alone Together, I started working on a project that has now been released publicly as HoloLand. Are you familiar with it at all? It's an immersive augmented reality platform that Microsoft is developing, which the visions are that you can have your own custom reality or augmented reality, so that when different people are interacting, they have all the computer graphics and information overlaid on their world. And I was curious.
So like what could I have?
It could be,
Give me, for instance,
say if
what
I look
could
at
have.
you,
Yeah.
the face recognition engine would say, that's you. It might pop up your LinkedIn information, other meta information, recall last conversations I had with you. It might say, hey, you saw Cheryl talk.
Well, wait,
Sherry
but
talk
do
to
I
her.
need to be wearing a headset or glasses or what?
Well, the vision of it is that it would just be, ideally as lightweight as these. The reality with our development kits right now is it's a bit of a helmet, so it's a bit intrusive. So I know actually Sharon contacted us and said, you're really going to do this out in the wild? Unfortunately, technology has prevented us from doing that far. So right now it's sort of sit at home and play around with it, but it's a large incubation effort. It's not a launched business. But I was curious what your thoughts are, because I know in Alone Together, there's a sort of progression of technology that you discussed between, years ago people would go into the computer data center and they'd interact with the computer once a week. And then, as computers came into the home, they might go in there once a day, they'd interact with the computer. As you get to cell phones, people are, the time multiplexing between computer-mediated information and non-computer-mediated information is getting smaller.
And here
With
you're
this
saying,
technology, they coexist completely. You have the computer world completely superimposed on the physical world everywhere you go. You walk down the street, sort of like Google Glass type stuff, except even more hyped. Very
well, you know,
context-aware.
in Reclaiming Conversation, I have a chapter on Google Glass that I call the empathy machine. And that's because when I interviewed the beta. They didn't call themselves the beta. They called themselves the pioneers. The pioneers. They called themselves pioneers, the people who got the first thing, the Google pioneers. So I interviewed like 20 Google pioneers or 30. And they talked about how it changed their conversation. And many talked about how it was an empathy machine in the sense that it allowed them to better put themselves in the position of the other person because they could perspective shift, that this was a value to them. The question is, and it's a question, is whether the fact that they felt they needed Google Glass to do that has to do with the fact that they don't talk to each other anymore. And Google Glass, that these worlds are some kind of, you know, prosthetic compensation that we're doing, but maybe we don't need to do. I mean, you know, I can kind of figure out, is this our prosthetic compensation? What does it mean when somebody says, I need to do this because it helps me put myself in the place of somebody else?
Yeah, the promise that was made with this technology is it stops you from having to leave the here and now to go and see the mediated world. By superimposing the mediated world on top of the real world, you don't have that weight, right? So when you get that text message in the middle of a conversation, you're supposedly be able to do them both at the same time.
Right, but why are you laughing?
Well, personally, I thought it was incredibly dystopian. It was like one of these.
So why did you work on it? I'm trying to see the good, and it was. I have you before me. I have you before me. No, but see. This is the point. If we grow up, let's say this thing is really successful. See, can I sit down? Like, is that like the drill, or is that like breaking some? Okay, so I try to think. Let's say this thing isn't just here in your development, but let's say you get your wish. See, I think that's what happened with the phones, is that we got our wish. The way the phones like make us these promises like a benevolent genie. You'll never have to be alone. You'll always be heard. You'll never have to be bored. And then our kids got this wish. They never have to. Well, it turns out that boredom is like one of the most important things for a developing child, is to be bored. When you're bored, your brain isn't bored at all. It's doing all this work neurophysiologically. It's laying down the default mode network. It's stabilizing your sense of a stable autobiographical self. You need that boredom time. So I think it's very important to say, okay, we got our wish with these phones, and now we sort of need to backtrack a little. So what I'm trying to think is, instead of seeing your thing as a kind of blue sky project, fascinating, what about if actually you got this? What about if now we were all here, but we could all also be elsewhere without us knowing that we're also elsewhere? Is that a plus? Or are we comforted by the fact of the transparency that when we go elsewhere, I can say, fuck it, put that away, I want your attention. See, I think a kid deserves to know if his parent is elsewhere and says, come back to me. I need you. Now, I mean, all this tugging at parents' sleeves and saying, I need you, I need your eye contact, I need you with me. I don't want you, doing fantasy football now. I mean, I need you now. I mean, I'm hoping you'll read the book. I mean, if you read the book, you'll see these kids are like at their parents for their parents' attention. And all these people who were saying, all of my, you know, kind of, I don't want to say my critics, but people who have this version that does not come from talking to kids, that kids don't mind because they only knew this way and they won't know any other way and they'll be used to it because they never knew a world without phones. These kids are, the reason they know another way is they want their parents' attention. That doesn't seem to go away. You know, it's like because they grew up with phones. So if you got your way, would that be better? I mean, I think that's the question. If you had this, if we were all here with little wearing contact lenses, so let's say it's as good as a contact lens, so we really can't see anything. So if I was here, but also, you know, this is a little boring now, so if I was reading my mail, you know, just like it's like a law, you know, it's kind of off. If I could do this and if I could multitask this part of the conversation and just check that nothing important had come in from my publisher or something, what's the plus? Where I would be reading your background instead of saying, hey, you know, what have you written lately? Is that a plus? I mean, I think we have to ask ourselves, well, again, one of my favorite lines of my book is technology makes us confront our human values, which is such a good thing because it forces us to find out what they are. So I think it's great that you did this project. I mean, I think this is such an amazing achievement. But would we be better off if we were all wearing contact lenses that had it? And I think it's a question. Me personally, I like a kid who can say, come back to me, put your phone away. The idea that I can be secretly buying shoes on Ann Taylor and my daughter won't know, it's not appealing. And that, I know I would do that. I know. And people do, it's like in my classroom, that's what kids do. They go, I mean, that's what we're doing in classes. 5 years ago, I surveyed the MIT Harvard faculty, and I mean, just to show you how this works. 5 years ago, faculty basically said, I don't want to be a nanny, I'm not their nanny, let them do what they want. And now it's, no one comes to class with a phone or a laptop. Finished. Because we don't want them elsewhere. So I come to your question, I must say, with that in the back of my mind, to see that change in a faculty so rapidly, because we don't want them elsewhere. So isn't your thing is kind of saying that it could always be elsewhere?
That was the vision, yeah.
Right, but I'm saying, hey, you know, I think in technology, it's important to be, like you say to a kid, it's important to be able to say you're sorry. We make mistakes. Like when my daughter was in, she's 24, she works for LinkedIn, which is God's way of, anyway, saying something. And she, when she was in elementary school, a notice came down as though from the heavens, there would be no more cursive writing. And just like, dear parents, and she went to a fancy schmancy school, dear parents, just to inform you, cursive writing is over. That's it. But they're going to learn to print so they can have a legal signature. They need to print. And basically, that's what they'll learn. It turns out now that cursive writing lights up your brain and is the source of like everything good about in your, I mean, cursive writing is like the best thing you can do for your brain and your creativity is to know how to do cursive writing. Who knew, right? So the question is, what are we going to do now? So I think if we had any like gumption, we'd say, well, let's bring back cursive writing. That was a mistake. We didn't know. So I don't see the harm in saying, you know, now that we think about it, what faculty members are basically saying is that now we've seen how it works out. We basically don't want students having laptops in classes to take notes. It really didn't work out. I'll tell you what happens. They start to transcribe the class. Because if you have a laptop, you can almost transcribe the class. And I tell a hysterical story in Reclaiming Conversation about Carol Steiker at the Harvard Law School, who, when her students were doing this transcription of her class, she found that they got annoyed if she interrupted them to ask a question because she was like ruining their transcriptions. And finally, one time, one of her students was sick, and in the hospital, and she she had them, the students volunteered to take notes for this ill student. And a girl came up to her who was in charge that day, the designated driver, and the girl said, my power went off and I didn't have my power cord, and Professor Steiker, could I have your notes? And Carol Steiker said, well, why didn't you take notes by hand? And the girl looked at her like she was a visitor from the planet Xenon, you know, like this was absolutely not, like even in the realm of possibility. And from that day forward, you know, that was the end. I mean, there was no more computers allowed in the classroom. So, you know, we change our minds. So I don't want to tell you what to do with your, it's not for me. Right.
Just a quick question, if you could say more about boredom and what you mean by that. Like in terms of literally no activity, or is reading boredom, or
Well, it's the experience of boredom. It's the experience of feeling I'm bored, I'm not stimulated. It now causes people to panic and reach for a device. So I do a lot of my field work I try to do things in natural settings. I'm not an experimentalist. I'm an empiricist, but not an experimentalist. So I stand at this kind of, I want to call it a grassy knoll in Cambridge where there's a stop sign, and I watch people's behavior at the stop sign. They stop, less than 3 seconds, and they take out their phone. There's something about that 3-second stop, which is like too much. It's too much time without the stimulation of having to watch the driving or something, they go to their phone. So these kids who, 6 minutes and they'd rather be stimulated than sit there. So boredom is kind of should be your imagination calling to you that you can just go into your inner life and think about your day, think about your life, maybe pick up a book, maybe just go into a reverie. I don't want to say, you should never pick up a book to, kind of have a thought, but you take a walk, they call it mind wandering. The experience that you're looking for is an experience of mind wandering. And what I'm finding is that people start to think of searching as mind wandering, and it isn't. So I have some incredible quotations, and I could have really written a book called Mind Wandering versus Searching. People who could not tell the difference between reverie and we're losing this distinction. I guess that would be my top level summation of what I found. That people have a hard time describing or experiencing a difference between searching on the web and reverie.
Thank you.
Yes.
So this is part question, part advertisement, part serendipity. But you spent a good deal of time talking about privacy. And for the next 2 days, this room is going to be occupied with the annual Microsoft Research Privacy Summit, Privacy Workshop. And I just want to know if there are any specifics that you would like included in that discussion, or you think are the right things to include in a privacy discussion.
Well, I think first of all, is it just a Microsoft discussion or is it an industry-wide discussion?
Just Microsoft, but it's between research and product groups and trying to get an understanding of what the needs are and where the research is and foster.
Well, I think it would be great if one company, let's say it could be Microsoft, says we commit ourselves, do the experiment of saying we have a business model. I don't know much about your business model and your products, but you don't seem to have, but let's just assume that your business model, let's just assume for argument's sake, that your business model doesn't depend on secrecy and keeping my data and not telling, let's just pretend. Wouldn't it be great if one company, one major company, said, we're getting, this country and, this industry is really getting ourselves into really a privacy bind here where and we just think that we can make a lot of money if we don't do that. So I think it would be unbelievable, and please invite me to this moment, to be part of this conversation. I think it would be unbelievable if a major company said, we can actually make money and not, and really honor people's privacy.
I think we're doing that.
Well, if you're doing that, I'm not saying you're not doing that, but if you're doing that, that should be, in other words, how you're doing that you're doing that, the ways you're doing that, how other people are not doing that, your commitment to doing that, and why you think that's important for the country, for kids to grow up knowing that. I don't know that about you. I've never seen an ad that talks about that about you. I mean, I'm not like
our ad testing says that people don't care.
What?
Because our ad testing says people don't
something.
care.
Well, then it's part of your. It's part of your job to start to, this is like people don't care about climate change. I'm saying this is the people don't. This is about it's a beautiful sunny day. I don't really caring about climate change is very difficult because I have to think about big business. I have no control about them. I have to think about the government. I can't. My God. I mean, it's very. I have to take political action. I can't even influence my colleagues in my department. How am I going to? I don't think of my. And beside that, I have to earn a living and take care of my family. So I'm completely aware that when you market test something, I'm sympathetic. People say, oh, don't bother me. And you'll see in my book, that I'm honest. I mean, I say, people feel overwhelmed. I call it an object. I'm always writing about objects to think with. I call it an object not to think with. People don't want to think about this. They'll twist around the conversation not to think about this. But then, what about but at a certain point, we're going to have to think about it because we're really not on a good path. It's sort of like with climate change. So I guess I'm saying that if you made it, what about taking the opposite tack and saying that, the education of the country about this issue and linking it to democracy, linking it to responsible development, linking it to intimacy, linking it to safety, linking it to is actually part of your global mission. Because I don't think it could hurt your image. And it's a space that isn't, it's not like it's a space that anyone else is taking. On the contrary, everybody else is taking the Prince of Darkness space. So if I were consulting to you, that's what I would suggest.
We did.
No, I'm very serious. It is a commercial opportunity. It's both a commercial opportunity and it's a do no evil opportunity.
We had the Scroogled ads for a while, and they were not deemed very successful.
I'm afraid I'm going to actually have to cut it off here. Sherry, thank you so much.